Hello and welcome to our depreciation next generation video. Today we are going to walk you through some of the depreciation basics of integration with our tax program, a general overview, and some of the new features of our new depreciation system. First, I wanted to give you a quick overview of what our depreciation program is and what it does. It's a complete assets manager with extensive reports, asset tracking, and it can work as a standalone, but it can also integrate with any of our income tax programs, from our individual 1040 program, 1120, 1120S, and 1065 programs. There are basically two modes in the depreciation program. The first and the most widely used is our income tax integration. Once you have a few configuration items set up to help the systems talk to each other, the income tax system and the depreciation system talk to each other, it's designed to automatically bring over your depreciation figures into the applicable program. The other method is a standalone. It's just a standalone assets management system, and you can utilize this without any integration at all. This is also the primary method or the mode to set up your initial depreciation. So some of your configuration items, where you would back up your depreciation data, and to generally set up your assets and handle some of your dispositions and things like that. So before we get too far into the details, just a broad overview of basic assets management would consist of adjusting client information or entering client information, recording the asset data or making changes to existing asset data, and then of course printing your reports, and then integrating that information into the applicable income tax program. So with that broad overview, let's go ahead and get into some of the integration stuff. I want to show you some of the integration things before we get down to the standalone method, and just show you how easy, especially the new assets management system is in making it work with the income tax programs. Before we get into the more detailed information, which we'll do over in the actual depreciation assets manager itself, I wanted to just briefly go through what your day-to-day might look like once you have your depreciation client set up, once you have your assets set up, and it linked to the tax return. So I'm just going to recall test number 2 here, and we'll go over to forms and schedules. And we'll put in a Schedule E, sure. And let's say they got $5,000 worth of rents this year. As soon as I calculate this return, you'll see that the expense line off to the left automatically calculates, because that brought in the depreciation figure, which is associated with this client through the, let's go into basic info here. It's associated with this test client with this depreciation file name. So now these are linked. So now when I recall a prior year return, it's going to recall that depreciation file from the prior year to the current year and year end to update that client, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Or if I'm simply recalling this as a current year and it senses that I haven't done any depreciation work yet, then it will also bring over that information from the depreciation module without actually having to go into the depreciation module. Now, it didn't take any of the features away as far as actually accessing the depreciation program from within. Let's say you needed to dispose of some assets, add some assets, you would go ahead and access it normally, make those changes, and then once you leave the depreciation program, it will of course bring you through the normal carry procedures and carry those dollar amounts to your Schedule E, Schedule C, wherever they might go. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and dive into some details on depreciation. And for that, we're actually going to open the depreciation as if it was a standalone itself. So let's go ahead and start with the opening page of the depreciation module. Now this is functioning as a standalone depreciation. If you had information that was linked to a tax return, it would skip this page entirely and go straight to the actual client itself. So I was using Clyde here. So if I was coming from a depreciate or individual or corp, it would skip that first page and bring you straight to the page that has that applicable client. But again, we're getting into a little bit more detailed information, so we want to start with the actual standalone start page. And so you'll see kind of the same concept that we have in our income tax programs. Off this start page, we have the ability to start a new client, recall a client, bring a prior client over from the prior year, and then we have some configuration items. I'll go ahead and start with configuration items. Again, if you're integrating with the tax system, you really should only need to go into this page maybe once a year, and you just want to make sure that your current year folder and your prior year folders are set correctly. Mine are a little bit different because it's a developmental machine, but if you're using the defaults, this would just go to like your C Taxware 19 DPR data folder, and this would be your 18 depreciation folder. Again, if you are using the defaults, there's really not a whole bunch to do on this page. We do need to know what your client ID is so that we can validate who you are, and that so you can update the depreciation system as needed. And then the rest of these items are more utilities. The front page configuration will go ahead and back up your client data for all of your depreciation clients, and it'll back that up to wherever you tell it your backup folder is. So if you're backing things up on an external hard drive or a USB stick, you would switch this to be the appropriate backup folder. And of course, I'll throw in a plug and just let you know that we feel it's extremely important to back up your data. If you have a computer that goes down mid-season, if you have a backup of your data, even if it was your prior year data, at least you've got something to work with. And there are features in the depreciation program that once you run them, like a year-end update, it advances all your recovery years. You could go through each asset and undo that, but that would be kind of a headache. So we strongly encourage you to back up your data. With the new system being prior year and current year, it's not as destructive as it used to be in that you're really only affecting your current year data. So kind of worst comes to worst, you'd bring over your prior year data again. But back up your data. It's always a good idea. If you're using departments, these are just your department titles. I'm not sure I even have any set up. Oh, I've got some test departments. These are just for reports. If you want it to default instead of typing in the department title, you can go ahead and set up some pre-canned department titles. And then these are how you want things to carry forward. If you want your disposed assets to go to the 4797, you check that, and it will ask you the additional questions to bring over that information. And then whether or not you're printing consolidated 4562s, this primarily is on the 1040 side, and that applies to, do you want to generate a 4562 for each rental schedule, each Schedule C, each Schedule F, or do you want all that information to be held in summary form on the 4562s? Entirely your preference. For now, I'm going to leave that unconsolidated for later when we integrate with the tax system. Now that we have our configuration and primarily our data folders set up, the other three options are just how you get to your client data. We'll start with new client, and we'll go ahead and select that. It brings up standard unique client ID. The only thing I would say about client IDs is these are different than the 1040 or the 1120 systems, in that it can be alphanumeric. So a good idea would be to put something in that basically makes sense to this client. Let's say this was a construction company and his name was John. I would recommend putting in John Construction or something. Go ahead and abbreviate it so the ID names don't get so large that they're in the way on the grid. But I would go ahead and name your clients something that makes sense to your clients. You can use numbers if that's what you want to do. So just some I don't know, my opinion on how you should name your depreciation file names. For now, well, we'll go ahead and create him so we can go through some wizards here. Okay, so on the basic information, a lot of these are purely optional for how you want your depreciation reports, the headers, your asset listings, your tax carry codes, what you want to print at the top of those. So for now, we'll just put see if we can type here. The only thing that's kind of not optional on this page is the fiscal year end date. And the reason this is not optional is when we're keying in, especially brand new assets, or we're trying to auto-calculate assets from the prior year, figure out the prior year depreciation, we need to know what the current year is of this particular client so that we can know, are we in recovery period 1 or are we in recovery period 5? This, of course, automatically gets populated per the tax year, so you don't need to do a whole bunch with it. And when you year-end update, actually that's old terminology. You used to have to year-end update, and we'll talk about year-end updating a little bit later. But if you recall this client from the prior year to the current year, then it'll automatically increment your fiscal year end date. So you shouldn't have to play with that a whole bunch. So basically carry preference items are over to the left. If you want your assets to automatically switch to straight line when that becomes more beneficial. More common is, do I want my state items to equal Fed? If this is checked yes, then it's not going to prompt me for the additional state prompts. It's just going to assume that the state equals the Fed and kind of skip those, so it helps speed things along. And then just generally, what program do you want this to interface with? So we're going to select individual tax for now. Down here, you'll see your Section 179 limits. These get set, especially on a new client, and they also get set during that prior year recall or year-end update to the current values. And then you will see these decrement as you are using 179 in the assets. If you ever want to know what 179 is available, you can come back in the depreciation basic info page, this page, and you'll see those numbers start to reduce as far as what's available. And then of course for the new year it resets. So recalling your clients, this page we set it up to work similar to the 1040. Obviously you don't have some of the filters, but we do have the, well, let's start. It does display what is your current folder and what is your prior folder, and you can change those. We also have a reconstruction feature in that if you are working on a laptop or you're bringing over a client that you haven't seen for a few years and you've put that into either your prior or your current year folder, you can use the reconstruct option, and then it will find that client and add them to your client selection grid. And then you have your current, so right now it's only showing my current files. You have your prior, so now it's only showing my prior files to recall from, and then a mix of both with your current on top and your prior down below. So really from this page you can do everything. You can recall prior clients, you can recall your current clients, you can also start a new client right from this page. Some people like to differentiate between what they're doing just to simplify things, and that's why we've added these three options. So the final option is prior client, and this will only show prior clients and will continue to show prior clients. Whereas in the prior year recall, if I'm recalling prior year clients from here, it will move them from the prior year to the current year, and then it will remove itself from the current year pick list because now it's a current year item. And of course you can see that the prior year has a slightly different coloration to it. So let's go ahead and get into an actual client. So let's go through this menu kind of item by item and get into a little bit more depth. First, it shows you the client ID. It shows you the client full name, but it also shows you the year-end date. Now this is pretty important if you are working with a client that you haven't seen in a couple years. If this does not equal the current tax year, then that's kind of a flag that you need to do a little bit of work, potentially do the manual year-end update, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So with that said, we've got some constant calculations off to the left, and now let's go ahead and select Add an Asset. So when we select Add an Asset, it's going to talk to you about how to number your assets. I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. So you can just say, don't show me this again once you kind of have a handle on how you want to handle or number your assets. But for now, I'm just going to say Continue. And it'll bring up that first page, defaulted to the asset number. And it automatically looks at the whole number and takes a guess as to what you think that the asset number might be, so you don't duplicate your asset numbers. So to just briefly talk about departmentalized assets, for regular assets you just put in a whole number, like 21 here. But if you are departmentalizing, we basically use the decimal value. So if you wanted to departmentalize assets, you can basically have up to 99 departments. And let's say I wanted this to be or go to department number 3. You just simply say 0.03, and whatever assets you lump together with that 0.03 is now going to print in your departmentalized reports. So that's all that other page was kind of talking to you about. For now, I'm just going to leave that a whole number, and the new asset wizard will just kind of walk you through the important items. For most assets, we just need to know an asset number, we need to know a description, we need to know a cost, a date acquired, and what method it is. So we're just going to say test, and we're going to say this asset, I don't know, $15,000. Now we're going to put in our date of acquisition, and I'm going to, let's go ahead and make this a current year or recovery period 1 asset. So I'm going to say it was acquired on 05/05 of 19. Now as soon as I hit enter, you're going to see that the prior depreciation fields are now going to disappear because it's a current year. So we're going to say that is current year. So now it tells us our recovery year is 1. And now we just need to select a method. If you're not quite sure of the method, you can use the lookup table and kind of browse through what you think it might be. Let's say this is, I don't know, let's say this is, let's say it's office furniture, really expensive office furniture. So you double click what asset it is, it automatically populates. And then, I don't know, if you need to change it, you can just go ahead and make the selection. This is the normal selection. If you know what the asset is, then you can say, oh no, that was supposed to be 5 years. Now that we've done our base depreciation work for that asset, we're just going to say OK. And then it's going to bring us into the main assets page, which I'm going to get into a little bit more in depth later. I just want to show you the new asset wizards for now. So I'm actually going to back out of that page. The next thing to talk about is either viewing or changing the asset information itself. And to do that, you just select Changes to Assets, and it'll bring up your asset your asset data grid. There's not that many assets for this particular client, but I do want to talk about the filters. First, on this page, you can click the tabs at the top and it'll resort things by the values up at the headers. You can also say, let's see, well, these are all Schedule C's. Well, except for this one that I just added. I'm sorry, Schedule E's. You can also filter this grid or narrow it down to only display the assets that you're kind of trying to look for. So we're going to say show all. If I had assets in here that had Schedule C or Schedule F, then they would show up in my major tax code list. I don't have those, so I'm going to select Schedule E. And now you'll see I only had the one asset go away. But now it's only showing assets related to Schedule E. But you'll notice that I have multiple Schedule E's in this listing. I have a rental 1, I have a rental 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we can actually get even more specific and tell it I only want to see assets for rental number 1. And now it just narrows down the list. Obviously, if your rental list, or sorry, your asset list is not that long, probably not that necessary. It's pretty easy to just use the search fields and find the asset that you're looking for. But if you're working with a client that has hundreds of assets, these are just tools to narrow down that list for you to get at the particular asset that is either disposed or you're just making changes on, and those kinds of things. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and get into the asset page itself, and we'll just use number 1 here. Of course, the heart of the assets management system is the assets themselves. In the new NextGen format, we've really tried to narrow down the information that's on the assets menu page. We still have access. We didn't take away any of the capabilities of the old assets management system, but we've moved a lot of them to the other page. And we'll cover some of them in a minute, but we're talking about book and preference items and some of the other items on that page. So on this page, we wanted to really focus in on the things that you might need to either change or just have overall interest in. So up at the top in this first group, you have your asset information, your description, your asset number. Let's say this wasn't the correct asset number, or you forgot to add a department and you wanted this to go to department number 3. You know, those are where you can make those kind of changes. The date of acquisition and the recovery year. If you can imagine the makers tables and the recovery period in those makers tables, that's really what this recovery is talking about. Basically, it would be in line with the exact table item. So let's say you were looking at a 7-year makers table, and I was in recovery period number 3, you would find that third recovery year in that table, and your overall depreciation value should match. Now this particular asset is depreciated out, meaning that it is past its recovery period and all of the depreciation has been used, so it doesn't apply. So listed property, if this was an automobile, you know, we'd say what type it was, and then make sure you enter your listed property business percentage as a decimal. So like our example shows, if it's a 50% business usage, then you would enter 50% as 0.5. Okay, so your cost, your basis, those are pretty self-explanatory. Just note that your basis does not always equal your cost, especially if this is a brand new asset and you are using 179, which is what looks like happened at some point during this asset's life. If you are using 179, obviously it only applies to recovery year or recovery period number 1, then your basis will be reduced by your section 179 values. So you have your cost, your basis, your federal depreciation. Your federal depreciation when you are recalling from the prior year or you're manually running that year-end update process, this will automatically get calculated and folded into as the years go on. And then your method and your category, Let's say I was in the wizard that I just showed you and you made a mistake, and this was supposed to be I don't know, 20-year makers instead of 19. That's where you'd make those changes. You still have access to the lookup table if you're not quite sure what category it might be. And then this last item is the farm assets or half-year convention rules. And to back up just for a minute, let's say you made a mistake on the tax integration. Let me talk about that page just for a minute. The tax carry codes are specific to the 1040 system. For the 1120, well, it's mostly true. The 1040 system, as well as the S Corp and partnership programs. The partnership and S Corp, you can actually have it fill in up to 50 8825s. But for the most part, we're talking about 1040 integrations. So let's say this asset, I wanted it to go to Schedule E or rental number 3, and that was a mistake. We just changed that to rental number 3, or let's say it was supposed to go to, this was a Schedule C carry. I want it to go to Schedule C number 1. So that's kind of the way these tax carry codes work. You basically just think of the 1040 system and where you want it to go in the 1040 system. I want it to go to Schedule 1040, Schedule E number 1. And then once you're satisfied with that, you click OK, and then you can just see where it's going to carry that information to. Some other items that will show up are alternative life methods, and to get that, let's go ahead and let's see. Let's go ahead and pick straight line. It's going to ask me the federal life. So when we're using straight line, obviously we're depreciating over a specified amount of time. So we're going to say it is 18 years. Once I specify that it's not a normal method or a pre-canned method of makers, you'll see the alternative life field show up with my 18 that I just populated. So this does not display if it's a standard, makers or pre-canned life from a makers table. Let's see, duplicate asset, it's pretty self-explanatory. If I wanted to save a little bit of time, and this client brought me a bunch of assets and they're basically the same, they're going to be carried to Schedule E number 1, and I just want to speed up a little bit of time, I can use this duplicate asset function, and it will auto increment the asset number. It'll pre-label the carry code and basically just speed up the data entry of assets. And then the other function on here is the auto calc prior depreciation. So this has purpose when the client brings you, let's say it's a new client, and they have a rough asset listing, or they don't even have an asset listing. You're kind of reconstructing things off of prior 4562s, and you just don't know exactly what the prior depreciation was. That's where this button comes from, or comes in. It will take its best guess. Now obviously if you know the prior depreciation, whether they followed the table or not, that's what should be input if you're trying to create a new client's depreciation. But if you don't know, they don't know, this is just a function to basically look at what the method is, look at when it was acquired, and look at what the current fiscal year end date is. In this case, it's 2019. And basically run through those tables year by year and accumulate what the prior depreciation basically should have been. And it's pretty close. At the end of the day, depreciation is more of a estimated value, but it should be pretty close. All right, let's go into other asset information. So in other assets, it has a lot of information. Some of it isn't utilized, so we moved it to a sub-page. Things like your book and your salvage values, your preference values. They're just not used that often, so we moved them off the main assets page so that the asset work would be simpler, a little bit easier to read, as well as just a little bit faster on your data input. So I'm not going to cover every item on here, but I will mention a couple. So obviously disposed assets do get used, and that's where you would find that information. What you need to note is obviously the disposition date and the disposition price, and those go hand in hand. If there is a disposition date, then the asset will be dropped during the prior year recall or as part of the year-end update routine. The disposition price is used when you print the disposition report calculating an overall gain or loss. And then if there's a tax carry code entered, the program will ask you if you would like to apply the disposition date to all the assets with the same tax carry code. And if that date was entered by mistake and applied to all the assets with that given tax code, then you can undo it by simply going back here and entering a blank date and a blank entry, and then it will do the same to all of those assets. Let's see, the exchange code is used to generate the exchange code report, and it basically ties your various assets together with that same exchange code for a specified report. And then your amortization code is used when you're assigning that amortized section, the amortized code section, for either printing the 4562s or generating the information for tax integration and the amortized report itself. And I think that's really all I'm going to touch on the other information. So let's go ahead and get out of here and go back to our main depreciation page. And I don't know if you noticed that the depreciation program does have the same breadcrumb associated with it as like our 1040 system or Corp system. So if you, let's say we're way deep and I just needed to quickly adjust something, you can speed up the overall process, and instead of clicking OK, 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 you can just say, no, take me back to the main menu. But that's universal of pretty much all of our tax programs, but I just wanted to point it out here as well. So the next thing I'll talk about is the reports. So our reports are pretty much self-explanatory. I'm not going to go into every report. I will talk about probably the most often or most common used are the asset listing report or the listing by tax carry code. Here's the department reports and department summaries if you are using departments, the 4562 itself, and then the projected tax code listings or projected asset listings. This is really helpful if a client calls you and is kind of interested to know, with my current depreciation set, what am I looking at for a deduction for this upcoming year? So you can print the tax projected listing. With one caveat, it does not advance the listed property rates because we don't know those rates until the following year. But overall, even using the prior year listed property rates, it should give the client a pretty good idea of what their overall depreciation and deductions should look like in the upcoming year. Some other very handy reports are the disposition list, and that information will basically get pulled into the 4797 as needed if that selection is checked that I showed you in the overall configuration um, section. It's pretty self-explanatory. You can either print directly or you can preview. And we'll just click preview here and it'll bring up my tax carry code list for this particular client and subdivide it by what it is. You know, I'm working with Schedule E, number 1, number 2, with the overall asset value. That can either be PDF or exported, or you can print it out and put it in the client's file for a good clean audit trail. Close that. The other pretty popular report is just the asset listing itself. We'll say we want to look at all assets. And so here we have the assets in its entirety for this particular client with the overall totals. So these numbers should match up, especially if you're using a consolidated 4562. That's about it, pretty simple. You can preview the 4562 pretty much at any time. It treats it as a consolidated when you're previewing it from here. So you can just kind of see a template of what that overall asset or overall depreciation might look like. I think that's it for reports. When we get into 1040, I'll show you how you can actually access the reports from within the 1040 system. But for now, let's go ahead and go over to our short year calculations. If you're running the short year calculations, there are basically two menus or two places in the program that work with the short year data and their calculations. The short year calculation that is accessed from this page is set up to do the short year calculation for all the assets pertaining to the current selected client. So to do that, again, this is one of those areas it might be good to back up all of your data before continuing. We're going to go ahead and put that in. Then all we need to do is really just enter our months that apply. We'll put in 6. And then it globally per this client applies the applicable short year calculations. Now if you want to look at those, we will just, recall asset 1. If you just kind of wanted to verify some of that information, you go to the other asset info and you have your short year data and that gets applied. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and go back to our main menu and look at our mid-quarter computations. So it's recommended that a copy of the mid-quarter computation worksheet is printed or displayed to aid in the decision of the mid-quarter computation. When you're working with any of the non-standard calculations, again, it's always a good idea to grab a backup of your data. So once this is selected, option 1 is just simply to undo the mid-quarter computation. The other option is to go ahead and proceed with the mid-quarter computation. And it just a little warning. So we'll say go ahead, and we're now finished with the mid-quarter computations. Well, a couple things. On your printer reports, like your asset listing or your tax code, off to the far right, I'm not sure I have any, but we'll take a look. Yeah, I don't really have any. Well, that's not true. I've got a queue there. So it shows you what assets are either disposed or had a quarter worksheet applied. And obviously your mid-quarter computations are affected by recovery period 1 assets, which is why our test asset applied. But if you see a D or a Q in your asset listing or your tax code listings, that is just to help you identify which assets had those conventions applied to them. Miscellaneous options are very similar to what I showed you in the config. at the beginning of the system, working as a standalone. But these options pertain specifically to basically this client plus a few depreciation carry items. So if you want to back up data, this particular backup feature is only going to back up the data for this client. So again, if you are about to run year-end update or about to do a mid-quarter computation, and you're like, oh, let me grab a backup real quick, and you don't want to go all the way out, you can quickly grab a backup of just this particular client. The next items are to automatically resequence or resequencing. So basically resequencing is an option, and it'll ask you to input the carry code of the item that has been disposed or deleted. And after this has been entered, the program will go through your assets and reduce the tax carry code of any assets that fall within that code by 1. So an example would be if you have a client and they sold their third rental, the assets associated with that rental would be disposed, and during the year-end update or the prior year recall, when it fires that off, that wouldn't be included. So this client had 5 rentals but now only has 4. You may want to change the code or the carry code of the assets pertaining to the other rentals. So in the resequence, this function, you would enter 103, the third rental, as the old one, and the program will then go through all of the assets and reset the tax codes of the other rentals to lower it by 1. So basically you don't have space in between, and you don't, on the 1040 side, you don't have to leave an empty container of a rental that doesn't exist anymore. So that's what the resequencing is. The carry codes, or the carry information, similar to what we had already talked about, so I'm not going to touch on them again. They do the same thing. The last option on this page is year-end update. So in the old system, year-end update was a requirement. In the old system, it really wasn't year specific on its data folder or storage, meaning you could just have a depreciation data path and leave that depreciation data path without a year in it, and year-end update. So we had to create all sorts of wizards and things to make that as easy as possible. In the new system, we pretty much require you to recall data from the prior year into the current year. And as a function of recalling your data from the prior year, we run year-end update for you. So for the most part, you will not need to click this button. Now where this would come into or have application is if you didn't have a client that came to see you, let's say last year or a couple years ago, they went to a different tax preparer or what have you, and now they've come back to you and you still have that depreciation data. Recalling that person from a client from a prior year is obviously going to be 2 years or 3 years or however many years old, and it's not going to be lined up with the correct recovery period. So you might have a client that says 12/31/2017, and you know that this client is out of sequence by at least a few years. That's where you would need to run this year-end update function. Again, you don't need to run it if the client's seeing you from year to year and you're recalling them from the prior year to the current year. So we'll go ahead and make that selection just to show you how it runs. Actually, I'm going to change my client real quick because this one is working, a working client. I haven't seen them for a while. This is perfect. So I haven't seen this client this year. They are a 2018 fiscal year client. So now we're going to manually run the year-end update. It gives you a big warning because once you run the year-end update, the only way to fix it, if it's run by mistake, is to restore it from a backup or go grab the prior year data and pull it in again. So we actually default it to cancel. So if I hit yes, it's actually going to cancel this operation. I say no, and I'm going to ask you just one more time, are you sure you want to run the year-end update? And we're going to say yes. It allows you to look at the 179 maxes. For the most part, you're just going to hit enter on those values. And now I'm done with the year-end update. And you'll see that this has been advanced by 1 year. So let me bring over a list of what the year-end update's doing behind the scenes, just so you can kind of understand what's going on. Okay, so here's a list of what takes place behind the scenes in the year-end update function. And all this is available in the documentation that comes with the program. But basically, it does six main things. All of the recovery years, remember those maker tables that we talked about earlier, are going to be advanced by 1. They're going to be incremented by 1 so that it matches the new table period or rate. Any assets that have been disposed are deleted, and then the current year depreciation amount is added to the prior amount. The Section 179 allowances are adjusted for the new year. The current depreciation for each asset is recalculated at obviously the new recovery year rate or the recovery period rate. And then the fiscal year end date, which you already saw, is advanced by 1. So in a nutshell, that's what's happening with the year-end update. Now again, just to reemphasize, you don't need to click this button if you're recalling your data from a prior year. I only mention that a few times because this is a departure on how we used to handle our depreciation. So the last thing I'll talk about is just the program integrations themselves. We've walked through basically setting up your assets and setting up your depreciation. And it's really simple as far as getting it to talk to the various income tax programs. So let's go back into my test 2. We've kind of already shown you this a little bit, but on the 1040 system, the 1120 system, on each of the basic information pages, somewhere you'll see the depreciation file name. Now, if you don't know the depreciation file name, let's leave this blank for this test here. We'll go into forms and schedules, and we'll go into depreciation, and it brings us to our start page because it doesn't know what file to link it to. But we know who we're working with, so we're going to say it is Clyde Kuntz, and we make any adjustments that we need to make. And then when I leave the depreciation, it's going to do the same thing. It's still going to bring all that information back fresh. And now that it's been back in our basic information of the program, it has that linked, so you never really have to do that again. This is really nice because once that's in there, when you're recalling data from the 1040 system or the 1120 system or whatever income tax program you're working with, it will recall the depreciation data as well. So you don't have to go into depreciation and recall it from prior year in the depreciation system itself. The tax system will take care of it for you. It will copy your depreciation file name from the prior year, put it into the current year, and run year-end update, and bring over the value into the system. So to talk about that just a little bit more, let's go into our forms and schedules and bring in, let's pretend this didn't exist, and I will need to go clear out. Okay, so this is like a brand new client. And so I'm going to recall this client, but I haven't gone into the depreciation program, but it moved it from the prior year to the current year. It's going to automatically ask me the depreciation info, And now when I go in and I do my Schedule E work, like we showed you a little bit earlier, we'll again say 15,000. I didn't have to go into the actual assets management system itself. It knew that for Schedule E number 1, we need to plop its depreciation value in there. And if I were to recall Schedule E 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, you would see that same result, Schedule Cs and whatnot. Another feature with the new NextGen depreciation is if I don't have any assets that are changing or disposed of, but I still want to keep a copy of some of those audit reports, you can go to Form Print, and the depreciation reports will actually show here. And I'll just click that, and it'll bring me straight to my reports page, select whatever reports I'd like, preview, print, and then when I'm done, I'm back at the tax return. So I moved over to the 1120 system just to quickly show you the differences. So we'll access any work. Basic information, and this is where the depreciation file name would be. Obviously this is just an IRS test return. And you have the same linking capability as you do on the 1040. If I were to access depreciation from here, it would automatically bring in the depreciation file name, so I only have to do that one time. The differences between the entities or the business forms and the 1040 is you're pretty much just utilizing a consolidated method, and that gets pulled into one line instead of multiple schedules into our overall depreciation values. So we'll just, I'm not sure I have any set up for Corp, but we'll see what we have here. Select a client. Yeah, I don't have any. So we'll just use our imaginations and pretend that there was actual depreciation value going back to Corp. It will ask, would you like to carry to your any column of your balance sheet? It's just, this is a great warning. I forgot to touch on this, but it knows that I haven't year-end updated this client. So it's showing me, hey, you might need to do something here with this client as I'm carrying that information in. And then you saw in our overall depreciation brought that in. If this was an 1120S or a 1065 return, it would know to automatically split any 179 values, put that on the Schedule K, and then of course we talked about the 8825 already. But then when we go back into our basic info, it has the client file name. So don't worry too much about if it's a new client or one that hasn't come back for a while and this is blank. It's pretty easy to find the client that you're working with, or set up that client on the fly, and when you close that client, then it would bring in your brand new client into the appropriate field. All right, I think that is all I wanted to show you as an overall walk through the depreciation system. I hope you found this useful. Do refer to the documentation included with the program. It has some additional details. Other than that, feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have.